What we are hoping to do over the next 50 minutes is to look briefly, and it will be very briefly, at 5 subjects. As Phil has indicated, he has a suspicion, as we do, that the Anabaptist tradition, the Anabaptist vision, might have something helpful to say to us as we think about mission in contemporary culture, and in particular as we think about creative church planting. So very briefly, we're going to look at 5 areas for about 10 minutes each. We're going to start off with looking at post-Christendom, something of the culture we're currently in. We're going to be looking at the Anabaptist vision and what that might perhaps offer to us. We're going to be thinking about a couple of aspects of the Anabaptist tradition, Jesus-centeredness and a focus on peace and justice. And then we're going to just begin to look a little bit at another post-pandemic, as we begin to move very, very slowly out of lockdown. What have we learned? What might we take forward? What opportunities are beginning to emerge? Let me start then with the context. I hope that you may have had an opportunity to look at something which Isabella circulated ahead of time, which is a brief summary of post-Christendom. There's a definition, and then there are a number of transitions. And this is an attempt that I made 20 years ago to try to understand some of the changes that were taking place in relation to church and culture, and to signal that what we're describing with the term post-Christendom is not a fully formed new culture, but is a time of change. And so transition is the key word. We are not where we used to be, but we're not yet into whatever is emerging. We're in this time of change, of transition. And so we have perhaps many more questions than answers. And any answers that we do come up with may need to be provisional, because we are still very much on that journey. But our context is changing. It's looking likely that when the results of the 2021 census emerge, for the first time, less than 50% will tick the Christian box. There will be more people ticking no religion than ever before, and there'll be a small increase, at least, in people ticking other religion boxes. That is a very significant change from 10, 20, 30, 40, and 50 years ago. It's a very different environment. We are continuing to journey into this uncharted territory of post-Christendom. Post-Christendom means, among various other things, that fewer and fewer people around us know the Christian story or believe it. More and more people around us are convinced that church is irrelevant, reactionary, outdated, and something that they really want nothing to do with. And the church, the Christian community, is struggling to adjust to being a minority community on the margins of a plural society. Post-Christendom is a challenging situation. We haven't been here before. This is not the kind of scenario that a couple of generations ago people would have imagined emerging, but it is where we are. It's a challenging environment for church generally. It's a challenging environment for mission and for church planting. But there are also some tremendous opportunities. I am enthusiastic about post-Christendom. I don't think Christendom was a very good idea. It lasted for many centuries, but I think it was flawed in really quite fundamental ways. And I think there are some tremendous opportunities emerging as Christendom declines and as whatever post-Christendom is going to become emerges. One of those, which should get the evangelistic juices flowing, for those of you who are and see yourselves as evangelists, is that in post-Christendom, we have the opportunity to tell the Jesus story to people who've never heard it, people who know nothing about it. Now, that was something that the early Christians, the early missionaries had as they moved away from their Jewish roots into Gentile territory. But for hundreds and hundreds of years in Europe, we have not been in that situation. We've always been telling the story to people who thought they knew it already. But to tell the Jesus story to people who have never heard it, know nothing about it, for whom it really is new, seems to me to be a remarkable opportunity. We have in post-Christendom the opportunity to demonstrate that the local church, the emphasis there is on local, that the local church can be a community of compassion, of care, of vision, and of hope. And while people may continue to have a very negative view of the institutional church, the national church, actually the church in the locality has often been a place of good news. And as we move out of this pandemic situation, perhaps we will bring with us some good stories and some good reputation as communities that have been involved in compassionate ways over recent months. Another post that we need to consider as we think about post-Christendom is post-secular. 40, 50 years ago, there was a strong conviction that our society in the West was going to become more and more secular. That seems now so outdated, and increasingly the language of post-secular is being used to describe a reality which is very different from what was anticipated, where globally religion has not only made a comeback, but is hugely influential in all sorts of areas, and where people today are open in a way that they weren't before to spiritual reality, as long as that isn't accompanied by dogmatism. Are the ways in which we can share faith that are more open, more responsive, and less dogmatic than perhaps we have done in the past in the Christendom era. So towards the end of the presentation, we want to just look at some of the opportunities that might be emerging as we come out of this lockdown period, as we think about what we've learned, as we wonder whether church might be different, as we wonder whether there are fresh ways of engaging in mission. But actually this reimagining and creativity has been around now for quite some time. In many places, in many situations, Christians have been reimagining what church might look like. And that is a sign of hope, I think. I've been involved personally in church planting for over 40 years now. And I remain convinced that church planting is one of the ways in which we need to grapple with the challenges of a changing culture. It's not the only way, but I don't think we're going to be able to journey well into post-Christendom without church planting. Church planting gives us opportunities that you don't have in a more settled situation. But that's only true if by church planting, we mean something creative, something reflexive, something that is prepared to ask searching questions about ecclesiology, about missiology, about what is the good news and how do we incarnate that locally. And so as Reach develops and pursues one of the goals that Phil outlined a moment ago about church planting, my question really would be, what will be a sign of encouragement and progress for you? Will it be the planting of many churches across London? Will it be the growth of large churches? Or perhaps will it be the growth of churches that are learning how to incarnate the good news of Jesus Christ creatively and contextually? Because it seems to me that's actually the genius of church planting. It's not primarily about many or big. It's about ways of being church that are good news in a changing and complex culture. And so my hope would be that that's what Reach is committed to. Maybe that's something we can pick up in the discussion later on. Why do we think the Anabaptist Vision might have something to offer? Alex is going to talk more about that a bit later on this evening. But just two comments before I hand over to her. I don't know how much you know about Anabaptism. Anabaptism was a 16th century radical renewal movement that was committed to church planting in a time of culture shift. The beginning of the 16th century was perhaps the greatest time of tumult and revolution and transformation within Western culture before our own. It was a time when everything seemed to be up for grabs. All the old certainties seemed to be disappearing. It was a time when the medieval worldview was giving way to the modern worldview. And in that context, Anabaptists began to ask searching and dangerous questions about what church is, what mission is, what it means to be followers of Jesus. Some of those questions, I think, are just as relevant today. And 500 years ago, the Anabaptists said that Christendom was a bad thing, that the relationship between church and state was not helpful for either, that it was damaging to both. They argued that the church needed to be free to be the church, and the state needed to be free to be the state. 500 years ago, that was a very radical claim. For 1,000 years before that, everyone had assumed that church and state worked together as the pillars of a sacred society, And the Anabaptists said, no, that's a distortion of the gospel. The church should not be colluding with power and with wealth and with status, and sadly, even with violence. 500 years ago, they called for that separation and urged for a more radical form of discipleship. And so for 500 years, Anabaptists have been exploring what church looks like on the margins, what it means to be a countercultural community. Almost all other traditions that we're familiar with in this country have grown up within the Christendom era, have remained immersed within the Christendom worldview, and are now struggling to come to terms with post-Christendom. It's not that the Anabaptists have worked everything out, but they have been at it for quite a long time, 5 centuries of exploring what it means if you put aside the Christendom framework and ask what it means to follow Jesus without that. So we'll say more, but that's really just by way of introduction. Post-Christendom is the reality that we face. It's a time of significant challenge, but it's also a time of significant opportunity. And my hope is that Reach will grapple with the realities of post-Christendom, both its challenges and its opportunities, and will shape its approach to church, to discipleship, to church planting, to all forms of mission in ways that are relevant to that context. But let me stop there and hand over to Alex for the next section.
The post-Christendom stuff that Isabella sent around, there was also the core convictions of the Anabaptist Mennonite Network. If you can have those to hand, that's great. If not, that's absolutely fine. I'll read them out. Just some of them are quite long. And I'm going to start with the 7th conviction. We're going to spend a little bit of time looking at a couple of the Anabaptist Mennonite Network core convictions. What does it mean to be an Anabaptist in the UK today? This is not a definitive list. It's not an exhaustive list, but it's 7 things that a group of people who identified with the Anabaptist tradition got together and created and said, yes, this seems about right. This seems like a good foundation for working out how we articulate this Anabaptist faith. So the 7th conviction is about peace and justice. And it says this: peace is at the heart of the gospel. As followers of Jesus in a divided and violent world, we are committed to finding non-violent alternatives and to learn how to make peace between individuals, within and among churches, in society, and between nations. And the key thing here is that it starts with Jesus. Jesus is central to our peacemaking. He is the peacemaker, as Paul writes in the letter to the Ephesians. He himself is our peace. If we want to know what peace means, we have to look to the life of Christ and how he lived. Secondly, Jesus' actions are part of a new reality, the kingdom of God, which he declared he initiated in Luke 4. Jesus teaches explicitly that his disciples are called to love their enemies and pray for them. And the Anabaptists considered the teaching from the Sermon on the Mount as foundational for their faith and discipleship. It was not just for those in religious orders or priests and scholars and, special Christians, but just for ordinary believers in Jesus, the Sermon on the Mount should be important. Jesus offered and taught a radical alternative to survival under the political oppression of Rome. And that was through the creation of a new kind of community where Romans and Jews were part of the same family as forgiven and restored people. And they were all given a new purpose to share this good news of peace with the nations. And finally, the cross of Christ is the supreme symbol of nonviolence. As Alan Kreider writes, a Mennonite historian, he wrote, for Anabaptist spirituality, the commitment to nonviolence is not biblical fundamentalist pacifism or a conscientious objection to participating in violence. It is a radical attachment to the person of Jesus. Jesus chose the way of the cross as the clearest expression of how God confronts and deals with human evil, not by responding in kind, giving evil for evil, but by extending self-giving, non-resistant love. In the resurrection, God declares Jesus to be Lord of all. The reconciling work of God is manifest, and God vindicates the apparent foolishness of his peacemaking Son. As Jesus is our example and the one whom we seek to imitate, it follows that the church, as the people who have been reconciled to God and to each other through the gift of the Holy Spirit, act as a sign and a witness of God's intention for creation. So what might this radical attachment to Jesus as the peacemaker look like in our Christian communities? I'm going to look at this in two sections. First of all, the home game, the domestic policy, looking at worship, that upward movement. The church is shaped by the stories that we tell, the songs that we sing, the ways in which we pray, and the things that we pray for. Think about some of the most popular Christian worship songs at the moment. Do they talk about the life as well as the death of Jesus? Do you sing any songs in church that talk about reconciliation or peacemaking? How about when you read scriptures together? Some early Anabaptist communities took a much more communal approach to preaching than we are used to, often having 3 or 4 people offering their interpretation of the passages from the text instead of passively listening to one single voice. In worship, we are recalling and retelling the big story of God at work throughout history until now. It's an opportunity for us to remember the narrative of our faith and of the God who is reconciling all things to God's self. One of the most central practices of a peace church is the sharing of communion in the context of a shared meal. Jesus was regularly at table with his disciples and followers. And for us, it is also around the table that we become aware of Christ's presence in others and in our midst. Communion is a time when we remember the how of Jesus's life, enemy love, and radical inclusion. And for the early Anabaptist communities, it was also a significant moment for committing again together to journey as fellow pilgrims to their brothers and sisters. What about pastorally? How might we be informed by the Anabaptist vision? Well, churches inspired by the Anabaptist story might invest time in exploring different tools, resources, and processes to resolve conflict and disagreements. One example comes from E1 Community Church in Shadwell in Tower Hamlets. During my time in ministry there, we set aside 6 months to delve deeply into how we as a church dealt with conflict. At the conclusion of this time, the church signed a written agreement detailing the steps for conflict resolution in the community. So that's our home game. What about our away game, the foreign policy of being a peacemaking church, our outward movement? The God whom the Bible reveals is a God who has a mission to bring wholeness to creation and to reconcile former enemies. The Missio Dei of God is not for the church, it is for the world. God invites the church to be part of this work of shalom, but a peace church is not an end in itself, but an instrument of God's mission of reconciliation. So some practices that we might consider. Churches which take peacemaking seriously are churches that are educated and aware of the violence in their communities and wider society, so that they're able to engage with people's questions around peacemaking and alternatives to war and retaliation. Peace churches are places where we should talk about societal violence in its different forms and develop alternative responses and ways of imagining how the world might be. Our churches can also be places of training in peacemaking. An example is Christian peacemaker teams. They were founded in the mid-1980s by members of the historic peace churches, which included the Quakers, Church of the Brethren, and Mennonites, on the passionate conviction that peacemaking should require the same level of investment, commitment, and sacrifice for peace as governments demand in relation to war. Speaking in 1984 to the Mennonite World Conference in Strasbourg, Ron Sider implored his listeners, "We must take up our cross and follow Jesus to Golgotha. Unless we are ready to die developing new, non-violent attempts to reduce conflict, we should confess that we never really meant that the cross was an alternative to the sword." More recently, Juliet Kilpin and Simon Jones co-founded Peaceful Borders, an organization inspired by the Anabaptist story with the aim of seeking peace in the spaces in between. The work of Peaceful Borders is focused around accompanying and equipping people responding to forced migration by supporting new arrivals to the UK, building capacity for peaceful responses to forced displacement, and advocating for displaced people. Churches committed to nonviolence must advocate for peace and justice and address the root causes of systemic injustice, conflict, and war. Sustainable development and enduring change requires long-term partnership and commitment from locally connected groups, communities, and churches. As well as these big stories that might inspire us, we are also called to acts of everyday peacemaking. Christians inspired by the Anabaptist Vision might consider how a commitment to peacemaking extends to hosting spaces for difficult and nuanced conversations in a time of cancel culture, fear around holding countercultural opinions, and growing online and offline aggression. Most people can't commit to training with a Christian peacemaker team with the view to being sent into an area of conflict. But perhaps we might be inspired by other stories of ordinary peacemaking, like the split-second decision made by Dirk Willems, a 16th century Dutch Anabaptist, who, after crossing a frozen lake to safety, turned around to save the life of his pursuer, who had fallen through a hole and was drowning, despite the fact that he knew he would lose his life for saving another's. Or the example of the Amish community of Nickel Mines in Pennsylvania, who immediately extended forgiveness to Terry Roberts, the mother of the gunman who killed 5 schoolgirls and injured others when he opened fire in their one-room school in 2006. Since then, the Amish community and Roberts have continued to offer mutual support, comfort, and friendship in the midst of loss and grief. Or in more recent times, the local Baptist minister who, on seeing a restless and fractious group of young people gathering in their usual haunt near her home, quickly got baking and within 30 minutes had managed to dispel the atmosphere of intimidation and violence with freshly baked cupcakes. This turned out to be the beginning of an ongoing relationship of trust, support, and friendship, which emerged out of one brave, spur-of-the-moment act of mediation and imagination. These are just some of the examples, but the Anabaptist tradition has many other stories, resources, and experiences to offer that can help disciples of Christ individually and collectively respond to the call to follow Jesus, the peacemaker. Stuart, back to you.
For hundreds of years, the church has colluded with violence and has largely ignored the teaching of Jesus to love our enemies. That was not so in the first 200 or 300 years. In that period before church and empire got their act together, the church understood itself to be a people of peace. And it was their peacemaking, their non-violence, their commitment to enemy loving, which was so deeply attractive. This is missional, this matters. And in a post-Christendom world, peace churches may be absolutely essential if we're to find a new way forward. So often, peace has been regarded as something peripheral, something that perhaps an interest group in a church or a denomination has been committed to. What we're arguing is that actually it needs to be front and center. Peace is at the very heart of the gospel. It is at the very center of what it means to be followers of Jesus. Again, that might be something that you want to pick up as we discuss later on. Alex picked up the 7th of the Anabaptist core convictions. I want to take you back to the first one, which is really about the centrality of Jesus. Now, you may or may not agree with us about peace, but it's very hard to disagree with the suggestion that Jesus should be at the center of our faith. But is that really true in practical terms? Let me give you just a little bit of my own testimony. I grew up in an evangelical church. I was raised in a Christian family and went to church from before I can remember. And as a child in Sunday school, I certainly learned all about Jesus. I learned about his life, his teaching, his parables, his miracles, his conversations with people, as well as about his death and resurrection. But my adult experience in the same church and in other evangelical churches was that the life of Jesus largely slipped out of focus. Most of the teaching, most of the preaching was based on the Old Testament or on the epistles, very little on the Gospels. Anything about Jesus himself, especially at Christmas or Easter, tended to focus on his birth, his death, and his resurrection, as if nothing had happened between Christmas and Easter. And that strange omission has a very long history in the church, and it goes back again to the early years of Christendom. As the church and the empire began to make common cause, the emperor wanted a united church to unite his empire. And in order to have a united church, he encouraged them to produce a creed. And a number of so-called ecumenical creeds were produced in the 4th and 5th century, trying to spell out in quite difficult philosophical terms, but very concisely, what it was that Christians believed, really putting some boundaries around the faith. And one of the strange things about those creeds is the way in which they seem to almost ignore the life of Jesus, the very founder of the faith. They go straight from Christmas to Easter. He was born of the Virgin Mary, suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, dead, and buried. Yes, he was born. Yes, he died, but seemingly nothing of significance happened between those events. And that seems strange. What has happened to Jesus? Some ways of interpreting the death of Jesus, some models of the atonement, make the life of Jesus almost irrelevant. All that really matters for those understandings of the atonement is that he was born as a human being and then he died as Savior. His human life doesn't really seem to figure in that. And I believe this is one of the most pernicious legacies of Christendom, the marginalizing of Jesus, whose life and teaching was too radical, too dangerous, too disturbing for the empire, and for a church that, as I mentioned earlier, was colluding with power and wealth and status and violence. And it seems to me this is one of the opportunities that we have in post-Christendom to rediscover the radical Jesus who was too much for empire, who was marginalized, spiritualized, and remains so in so many of our churches and particularly in our worship. Alex mentioned the question of our singing. What do we sing about? How little is the life of Jesus in our hymnody? The way in which Jesus is referred to emasculates him in lots of ways, I think. For me, it was the Anabaptist tradition that reintroduced me to the Jesus of the Gospels. Anabaptists have insisted that the life of Jesus really matters, that his teaching is life-changing and life-giving and transformative, that we're to follow Jesus as well as worship him, that we're to learn from his human life. And as Alex said, the Sermon on the Mount was a favorite Anabaptist text, something to be lived and not just admired. So for me, the Anabaptist tradition has been revolutionary in terms of reconnecting me with the Jesus of the Gospels. How is this relevant for mission and church today? What relevance might this have for the Reach initiative? Well, let's be very honest. The church continues to turn people off by and large, but Jesus remains an attractive and intriguing figure. Many people remain fascinated by Jesus. And it may just be that the life and the teaching of Jesus is a better starting point in our culture than the death of Jesus. I'm not suggesting we should ignore the death and resurrection of Jesus. They are fundamental to our faith, but they may not be the starting point as we talk with people. It may be that the life and the teaching of Jesus will resonate in ways that at the moment the death and resurrection of Jesus may not. And it may just be that the way in which Jesus himself shared the gospel has relevance for what we do. I'm interested that Jesus asked far more questions than he gave answers, that he told stories rather than giving people propositions. Maybe there are things we can learn from the way that Jesus himself shared the good news. And maybe rediscovering the life and teaching of Jesus might undergird a more holistic approach to mission and a more radical approach to discipleship. Discipleship is very much at the heart of the Reach Initiative, as I understand it. Well, what kind of discipleship is it? What does a Jesus-centered discipleship really look like in our context? Jesus-centeredness sounds so obvious. I guess what I'm suggesting is it may not be something we can take for granted. And I wonder whether that might be an opportunity that Reach has as part of its program of learning together. What would it really mean to have Jesus right at the very heart, not just as some kind of spiritual figure, but as a radical, prophetic, marginalized figure that empire couldn't deal with? Perhaps in post-Christendom, that's one of the key questions we need to be asking. Back to you, Alex.
So I'm not sure how familiar everybody is with Anabaptism, and I would encourage you to check out the Anabaptist Mennonite Network website if you want to find out more and learn a bit more about the history. I'm not going to be talking so much about the history in this bit. I'm thinking more about Anabaptism today. So Anabaptism today in Belfast, Northern Ireland, sounds like Catholics and Protestant communities singing Christmas carols together next to the Peace Wall, part of the work of Soul Space, an organization which works for peace and reconciliation through cross-community events, training and service opportunities. Or Anabaptism today in Southwest England looks like a Zoom gallery, a weekly gathering of Jesus followers committed to a peace-centric gospel, who are creating space for exploring questions of faith, life, and theology. A gathering of folks who are stressed and burdened by the complexity of life, who are co-creating inclusive communities characterized by simplicity of life, simplicity of gatherings, and simplicity of spirituality. Anabaptism today in a Baptist church in London smells like home-cooked food, like tables pushed together as people gather from Kurdistan, Albania, and just down the road, pull up chairs, hesitant but tempted by delicious Syrian food. These are snapshots of some of the things that people across the UK, inspired by the stories, courage, and passion of the early Anabaptists, are experimenting with. These Christians are discovering a movement characterized by reconciliation, by deep discipleship, by peacemaking and hospitality as a context for mission. There isn't a long history of Anabaptists active in the UK. In the 1950s, Mennonite mission workers arrived in London and began welcoming students from all over the world to the London Mennonite Centre at a time when there was a lot of racial hostility around. The centre was also actively involved in the work of reconciliation. The North American Mennonites decided that instead of setting up a new denomination, which might threaten or be considered competition to local churches, the Mennonites would share information and insights from the Anabaptist tradition with Christians of other denominations and networks. The Anabaptist Network was formed in 1991, and it adopted the same policy of not planting churches, but instead offering resources and building relationships with Christians interested and inspired by the Anabaptist Vision. So aside from a Portuguese-speaking Mennonite church in Eastbourne and the Bruderhof community, which I'll say a little bit more about later, there are currently no explicitly Anabaptist Mennonite denominations active in the UK, although a number of churches of other denominations have affiliated with the network. There are, however, a number of people being drawn to Anabaptist values and inspired by the story of the early Anabaptists. The Anabaptist Theology Forum hosts regular seminars and opportunities for learning together. There are a number of online study groups, book groups, and when it's finally allowed again, actual gatherings of people in an actual room connected to the Anabaptist Mennonite Network. If you want to know more about these things, then we'll put you in touch with the details. Phil and Isabel will have those. In terms of my own experience of Anabaptist values being worked out in contemporary life, urban expression has been my main connection point. And I've been part of Urban Expression for nearly 12 years now. Urban Expression is an urban church planting and mission network, which was started in 1997 as a response to the concern that most church planting was taking place in more affluent areas in the UK, where there were already many established churches and where church planting efforts frequently and critically replicated the mother church. Urban Expression works as a grassroots organization. It's a network of people committed to radical Jesus-shaped discipleship, mission, and community in neighborhoods struggling with marginality and deprivation. UE now has 24 teams, I think that's right, Stuart, spread across the UK, and 11 teams in the Netherlands, which is our sister organization there. And teams are all different. They range in size and character, from social enterprises to missional communities, table churches, and retreat homes. The glue which holds the network together are 3 core values of relationship, creativity, and humility, and 7 commitments: to be on the margins, to being Jesus-centered, to being committed to the shalom vision of peace, to seeking the kingdom of God, nurturing uncluttered church, serving unconditionally, and building respectful relationships with all people. Urban Expression is not an explicitly Anabaptist church planting network. However, the Anabaptist Vision is apparent in the core values and those core commitments. Urban Expression teams live incarnationally in their neighborhoods, building relationships, seeing where God is at work, and seeking the peace of their communities. One of our Urban Expression teams in Bristol set up a social enterprise after he realized that his informal fixing up of people's bikes could actually be a business. Andy and Ray hire space on an industrial estate, and the bike shop has become a place of community and refuge for all sorts of different folk who drop by and call it their home, their community. We've touched on a number of the core convictions this evening, and together they could be considered a way of describing an Anabaptist spirituality. A spirituality with a particular emphasis on discipleship. One of the most frequently quoted Anabaptist texts is that no one can know Christ unless he or she follows after him in life. And no one can follow him unless he first knows him. This following after life of discipleship is threefold: an inward personal journey of understanding oneself, a Godward journey based on divine encounter, and an outward journey towards other human beings, and I would include creation too. These 3 elements together express our full spirituality and must be held together as interdependent. And I think the Anabaptist story has resources for us to do that well. The 6th core conviction of the Anabaptist Network speaks to that. And it says this: spirituality and economics are interconnected. In an individualist and consumerist culture, and in a world where economic injustice is rife, we are committed to finding ways of living simply, sharing generously, caring for creation, and working for justice. Now, in terms of creation, the early Anabaptists cannot be considered environmental activists or committed to green issues. However, there are notable examples of Anabaptist communities living simply as part of their commitment to Christ's call of discipleship. For example, the Bruderhof community, which I mentioned earlier, is a worldwide organization of Anabaptists with 3 communities in the UK. They reject all ownership of private property and personal possessions, instead holding all things in common and trusting God fully to provide for the community's needs. Work and worship are inseparable, and all forms of labor are equally valued and honored, whether that is farming, teaching in one of their schools, publishing in their publishing house, or product design in one of the community's businesses. Work is understood as an expression of service and love to the community and to their neighbors. The Bruderhof cultivate their own produce and meat, wherever possible, free from chemicals, and by using solar and geothermal energy, continue to explore reducing their environmental impact on the land. The Bruderhof community commit to living simply so that they can be generous with their support for the poor and the vulnerable. And I wanted to touch on racism and some of the injustices of our time. I think that those inspired by the Anabaptist Vision today must wrestle with the injustices of our culture, including racism, which has been painfully amplified by recent deaths, and the uprising of collective anger and demand for action. Statements and declarations about being anti-racist will need to be backed up with personal and collective work to hear more voices from various backgrounds, to understand white privilege, and to walk together the path of reconciliation. Christians today will need to discover and practice new disciplines as they follow Jesus and courageously break allegiances with white supremacist, classist, sexist, and patriarchal hierarchies. Christian communities must enact the way of Jesus to place the last and the least valued as first and foremost. And as we consider our missional engagement with the world and church planting, we must recognize that our actions as Christians take place in the shadow of colonialism and institutional racism. So wrestling with these issues alongside our Black and brown brothers and sisters is non-negotiable. I touched earlier on the significance of peacemaking in Anabaptist theology, and I think this is particularly pertinent here. Active peacemaking is needed for reconciliation and transformation to take place within each one of us as we deal with our own unconscious racism, sexism, classism, and then as we work together for the healing and shalom of our own Christian communities, our neighborhoods, and the wider world. I said at the beginning of this section that the first Anabaptists in the UK were Mennonites, and they took a deliberate decision not to plant churches. And that was the position for over 60 years. But considering the changing cultural landscape and wanting to affirm that Anabaptist values are communal and shared, to be worked out in community, not just as individuals, in the last few months, the network has decided that church planting will be one of their major focus areas. So if you're inspired by these stories and want to know more about them and how you could get involved, then get in touch with Stuart or I afterwards. Stuart, back to you.
Thank you. We have a few minutes left before you have an opportunity for some conversation and feedback. Please hear us carefully. We are not suggesting that the Anabaptist tradition has everything right. It's certainly a flawed tradition, like all Christian traditions. Nor are we suggesting that it has everything we need in terms of resources for mission in a post-Christendom world. But we are at least suggesting that it has something of what we need. It's a neglected tradition, a marginalized tradition, but a tradition that we believe has rich resources, stories, insights, processes, practices, experiences, which are particularly pertinent to a post-Christendom world. We're going to need the resources and the insights of many different Christian traditions as we journey on into post-Christendom. we're simply suggesting that the Anabaptist tradition needs to be part of that, needs to be heard, needs to be encountered, because it does bring perhaps some quite distinctive gifts that may be helpful as we think about what church means today, as we think about issues of discipleship and mission and church planting. Our time is nearly gone. I was going to say a bit about what does it mean to be a post-pandemic church. Let me just say a few things. There's so much more that could be said, but just a few things that I've picked up perhaps, and maybe that will feed into our ongoing conversation. So these are not Anabaptist. We've done the Anabaptist bit, if you like. This is just some more kind of general comments or reflections on what's going on. I'm a bit hesitant even to say anything because it feels too early in many ways. You know, we're still emerging out of lockdown. And yet I wonder whether we perhaps need both some real-time reflection and some reflection in a couple of years' time, and comparing the two. What do we pick up now, and what will we pick up in a couple of years' time? I'm also a bit hesitant because many others are engaged in the same process. There are lots of conversations going on about what will post-pandemic church be like, just as there are many conversations going on about what will the new normal be like, what will post-pandemic society be like. But I learned something new from all those conversations, and I think we need to continue to listen to one another as we journey into this new environment. One of the conversations that I was involved in several months ago had the wonderful title, Analyzing the Apocalypse. And it used the term apocalypse deliberately in two different ways, in the popular sense of a catastrophe, but in the biblical sense of revealing, unveiling. It's another way of talking about the final book in the New Testament, the Apocalypse, the Revelation. And the suggestion was that whatever has gone on in the last year, it has unveiled certain things. It's shown us things which we just didn't see before. And this was a fascinating conversation involving theologians, psychologists, economists, church leaders, many others. One very memorable contribution was from the head of a business school, who simply said this: for years, we have been upholding a broken economic system. And we've been training the next generation to do this. But it's broken. And we've known for a long time that it's broken. The global economic system isn't working. It can't work. It's completely flawed. She actually used rather stronger language than that. We knew it was broken. Now it's in plain sight. We're not going to do this anymore. And I came away from that conversation wondering whether church leaders are going to be as honest and clear-sighted as this. When we're able to meet together again, will we default back to what is familiar, either because our congregations insist on that, or because we lack the vision and skills to do anything else? Or will we have the courage and the creativity to do things differently? I wonder what you're picking up. Let me just share briefly a few things that I've been picking up, not because I think that I've picked up more than anybody else, but we've got to start somewhere. What might be different as we move forward? What are we learning from this period? First of all, I think many people have discovered that they were unhealthily dependent on church meetings and have taken steps to nurture their own spiritual lives and discipleship. They've become less passive, less dependent, and they will not be prepared to be passive consumers anymore. That will have implications for discipleship going forward. Secondly, few people seem to be missing sermons. Sorry, those of you who are preachers, but that seems to be the case. And people, of course, can access any sermons they want from the internet anyway. Some people are missing corporate worship. But most of all, people are missing community, relationship, friendship. What's that going to mean for church going forward? Thirdly, many churches have discovered more goodness, kindness, neighborliness, creativity, and initiative in their local communities than they realized was there, or that their theology allowed them to expect. Many churches have struggled to keep up with the caring, compassionate ministry of many outside the church. Rather than taking the lead, churches have been playing catch up. It's not true in all cases. In some situations, churches have taken the lead, but in many, they've been surprised and outflanked by what's been going on around them. What will that mean for mission going forward. There was an early and widely reported upsurge of interest in prayer, in Bible reading, participation in online church meetings, especially among young adults. Has that surge continued? I've not heard so much about that recently. If it has, will it persist after lockdown? Will there be a new spiritual openness? Has the pandemic somehow broken things open further in our secular society? Or will there be a counter-reaction? Historians report that after the devastating Spanish flu, the most recent pandemic that we've experienced, that period of suffering was succeeded by the Roaring Twenties, by a period of hedonism and excess. What are we expecting? What are we preparing for? Let me just finish with 2 or 3 very brief comments, and then Phil, I'll hand back to you again. I know our time is up. Just a comment on what this might mean for pioneering ministry. I spent most of my life working with and alongside pioneers. 3 initial thoughts maybe to take into the breakout rooms. I think there may be thousands of Christians no longer prepared to put up with the experiences of church that they regard as broken and unhealthy, and ready to engage in pioneering ministry and more holistic and relational forms of church. I think there could just be a release of energy and vitality for pioneering, and I wonder what we're going to do to channel that. Secondly, there's going to be an enormous amount of hurt across the nation. I think we all realize that. Illness, bereavement, domestic abuse, unemployment, failed businesses, food poverty, shattered dreams, and so much else. Whatever kind of pioneering we're involved in, whatever kind of church planting we're involved in, it has to be surely pioneering compassionate ministry, responding holistically. And thirdly, I think many other forms of pioneering are going to emerge in our culture. We're going to find fresh thinking about working practices, about transport, about city centres, about localism, education, health provision, economic and political priorities, and so much else. And so I think the question for those of us within the church who are interested in pioneering is, what can we learn from what's going on around us, from the other pioneers, and what can we contribute? This is, I think, a tremendous opportunity for pioneering. But we bring with us a sense of weariness. There are many, many church leaders that I have encountered over the last few months who are just so tired, who are disillusioned, who are frustrated, and are not really in a good place to move forward into this new season. We're going to need to be gentle and supportive with each other. Maybe that's something Reach can offer, a place of nurture, of encouragement, of resource, but also of challenge and stimulus, that we don't want to go back to the way things were, but we want to move on into whatever God is calling us into next.